Hi, welcome back to Tocqueville Talks. I'm Brent Nelsen, director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society. And as always, I'm here with Beth, my co-host, and we're talking about globalization these days. Last week we heard from Joseph Bramel, and this week we're hearing from Mark DiPlacido, who takes a very different take on globalization, right, Beth?
To say the least, yeah, from Joseph Bramel last week. So we get a true diversity of ideas at this event, I would say.
So Mark is from American Compass, which is a think tank that was established, I think, in 2020 by Oren Cass. And it's been called by some media outlets as J.D. Vance's think tank. So this is sort of the counter to the globalization view, the globalist view. And Mark DiPlacido, he represented his position very, very well and with great, articulation.
And evidence. He had a lot of PowerPoint charts.
Yeah, so he's really part of a group that is rethinking how the economy works. They're looking at tariffs. They're trying to restore manufacturing to America away from China and from other places that do it at very low cost, because they're trying to support American families and American communities, and they believe that reshoring a lot of this manufacturing activity back to the United States will really help with solidifying the foundation of American society as much as our economy.
Yeah, so he really gets into that and breaks down what is changing and why, and what policymakers saw that led them to move away from the old free trade model, and what the new approach means in practice for students entering the workforce. We also connect this, as usual, to Tocqueville and his idea that freedom depends on independence, and ask whether this new economic direction actually makes that independence more achievable.
That sounds really exciting. So, Beth, here's our conversation with Mark DiPlacido.
Welcome, Mark DiPlacido.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here at the Tocqueville Center. And I just wanted to start off by asking you what drew you into trade policy, and when you were working in government, what was the moment that you realized the decisions weren't abstract and that they were shaping real communities and livelihoods?
Sure. So I got to D.C. around 2015. So it was the end of the Obama years. And a lot of the policy conversation at that time was centered on kind of a really stagnant labor market, and also the issue of growth really not getting above 3% after the year around 2000, especially after the Great Recession. So we were still kind of making our way through the negative ripple effects of that major economic event. And like I said, it was really focused on the labor market, and in particular, why a lot of prime-aged, able-bodied males were dropping out of the labor force altogether, down from historic highs in the 50s and 60s of close to 97% down to under 90%. So that was driving a lot of the conservative economic conversation at the time. And people were starting to open up in 2015 different questions, or reconsidering economic policies that might more directly address that question. And then shortly after I got there, Trump declared his presidency and sort of introduced a lot of new issues into conservative economic thinking that had been dormant for a while, but we're not completely new. And among those was trade. So it took a few years to fully direct my attention to trade. I ended up getting hired towards the end of the first administration in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and that really solidified my interest. The first U.S. Trade Representative in the administration, Robert Lighthizer, was really an intellectual godfather of kind of the new trend towards higher tariffs and a more protective economy for American industry. So it was a real privilege to work with him and gain a lot of insight from that job.
Well, speaking of tariffs, we're living in this moment of moving from "quote unquote" cheap goods and efficiency to strong industries, good jobs. And for students, I was wondering particularly, where do you see, is there a trade-off here? What might younger people especially be gaining, or what might they have to give up? And what do you see, I guess, as maybe needing correction in the current rhetoric out there, if anything?
Yeah, so I'd say sort of two things. What's important, I think, sort of zooming out, is I think, and what my organization, American Compass in particular, is sort of concerned with, and people more on my side of the issue, is that I think for too long we've seen the population as sort of mere consumers when everybody should be, right, both a consumer and a producer. And that can be both in the labor market and in the home, in a broader community. And I think for too long we've kind of single-mindedly focused on consumption without asking deeper questions also about what is fueling that consumption. I mean, there's been plenty of attention on the right to the budget deficit and the growing national debt. Structurally, I think we're sort of diving a layer deeper and asking maybe there are bigger structural ways that our economy is fueling that debt beyond merely irresponsibility by Congress, which there's no shortage of that as well. I would say on the maybe more direct front for college students, what this has meant from a policy framework for education in particular is I think we focused a lot on college education and college graduation as sort of the highest benchmark for education policy. We pursued really a college for all model over the last 30 or 40 years, and it's ended up serving our population broadly very poorly. If you look at the labor market today, it's still only about a third of U.S. adults in the working population have a college degree. There's still 2/3 that don't. This is the reason why this is an issue, is that a lot of people take on a lot of debt. They don't end up finishing their degree, and even people who do oftentimes don't get a job that actually requires that degree. And so the cost benefit analysis is being questioned, I think more broadly. And what we have to do economically, I think, is make sure that our economy is giving opportunities and pathways to people who aren't going to be a coder someday, or aren't going to be a college professor or an academic someday. And we want to make sure we're pursuing an economic policy that casts opportunity for a wide swath of the population, and to get up really the economic performance and the economic security of the non-college educated. If you look at there's been a lot of focus in the last 10 years on deaths of despair and people struggling with addiction. I think a lot of that is driven by a lack of job opportunities that have dried up because of globalization, because of competition with China in particular. And that's created disparities even in life expectancy. The average American with a college degree now lives 8.5 years longer on average than an American without. So even just in a health context, an immediate life quality context, there's been kind of a two-track economy for the last few decades, and we really need to tackle that.
Wow, that's interesting. I'm not even sure where to go from there. There's a lot. Because I'm thinking of two directions. I guess one direction would be, you mentioned kind of like going from the consumer and the producer. Is that like a mindset shift, or is that like a shift in what Tocqueville would say was like democratic mores altogether? And that seems to have maybe more of a sort of foundational aspect to it that might involve higher education, in the sense of this would require like really an education in the liberal sense of you're educating people in the sense of like, fundamentally how they think about big ideas and the habits that they cultivate and the virtues that they cultivate, both moral and intellectual. But then on the other hand, it seems like there's a very practical, consideration of how do you direct your potential when you're facing that moment of determining whether or not you're going to go to college, and determining what kind of career you expect to have, and making that kind of cost-benefit practical analysis. So could you just say a little bit more maybe about on both sides of that? Yes.
No, that's a great question, because it will allow me to really talk about the crux of the problem that I think people who are more on the protective side or more on the openness to tariff side. The question is really the trade balance. That's sort of the core issue that we're trying to tackle, that I think this administration is trying to tackle. And the way I explain that is we have now annually about $1 trillion trade deficit. What that essentially means is we are consuming $1 trillion more than we're producing every year as an economy. And that's not free, right? We still have to pay for those goods, even if they're at kind of a discounted or cheap cost, right? And what we end up doing is, instead of trading goods and services that we produce for those goods and services in return, what we often do is we trade our debt and we trade our assets to foreign nations.
I see.
And most people are familiar with the U.S. budget deficit, the way that accumulates into the national debt. People hear that, politicians use that framework a lot, reference those numbers a lot. On the trade deficit side, what this accumulates into is called the net U.S. international investment position. That has deteriorated to a point now where foreign entities own $27 trillion more in American assets than U.S. entities own in foreign assets. So in a real sense, what ends up happening is we're sort of trading away the farm to consume today. And very much like our national debt, that will catch up, and that also creates bubbles and potential for a lot of disruption going forward. So it's a real vulnerability. I think, abstracting back to kind of Tocquevillian first principles. If you even go back to the works of Hume and Ricardo and Adam Smith and the Enlightenment economists, right? Even they recognized, or they were operating in a framework where trade was. There wasn't a capacity at the time for these major deficits. The formulation by Ricardo was you acquired wine by trading cloth, right? And when we operate now I don't want to get too in the weeds, but if we're in this financialized economy, the exchange rates between the U.S. dollar and other currencies is free floating. It allows for a lot more slack in the system for these types of deficits to grow. And just from an instinctive point as a conservative, you don't want to be an economy that's underproducing, and you don't want to be an economy that's undersaving. And right now, that has been the cost of open, indiscriminate free market policy under the guise of cheap goods and efficiency. And there are a lot of questions on the efficiency side that this raises as well. To briefly touch on maybe the calculus for the individual, it's important to understand the lag that policy has, right? So if you go back to, there's a famous line in, I think, the movie called The Graduate, that, the future is plastics, go into plastics. And coming out of, the 50s, 60s, 70s, we still had a really solid manufacturing base. It had still employed a greater portion of the labor force in the United States. Unfortunately, that really eroded over the subsequent decades, and that sends a signal to parents who are giving their kids guidance on what industries to go into. It obviously creates different job opportunities in different regions where you have major swaths of for a while the American South and certainly the American Upper Midwest that saw entire regions and towns hollowed out as factories went overseas. People get those signals, and fewer people choose to go into the trades. Trade schools get less funding; they shut down. We need to reverse that trend and really start to invest more, both for national security reasons and in, I think, recognition that having a wider set of opportunities for people in our population, based on the distribution of skill sets, based on the distribution of interests, remains, from a political economy perspective, something that's desirable.
So it sounds like, from this perspective, that it's not really like a 21st century attempt to fix something with a 19th century solution like tariffs. It's more like trade advanced in a way that was maybe in connection to maybe what you would be able to say, but I'm thinking like new ways of doing finance that were never before possible. And it left behind these other aspects of essentials. Like you can only trade so much if you have like a product that you're trading. Like you can only trade so much of that. You're still going to go home at the end of the night. Now we're talking about, as you say, like literally trading out like foundational assets.
Yes.
And threatening the idea that you have a like that's even possible.
Yeah. So I mean,
is that right to characterize in that way? Like it's actually a way to like catch up, or make them congruent, these different processes.
Yeah, there's a lot of background. I think to try to distill it the best I can. The sort of architecture of the global trade regime was really set up right at the end of World War II. On the currency side, we had the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 that agreed to anchor all world currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold. And I'll come back to that, but that was significant. And then on the trade side of goods and services, there was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1947. That laid a lot of the foundational principles for what would become the World Trade Organization in 1994. There were about 8 rounds of additional agreements reached over the next 50 years between those two agreements, but you have kind of the baseline of the world trade regime set up at the end of the war. What's important to understand at that time was that most of the world economy was devastated by that war. The industrial bases of Europe and Asia were bombed basically, and the United States at the end of the war had about 50% of world GDP and 50% of world manufacturing. And we were also facing down the Cold War and the Soviet Union, and if we allowed for political instability to continue throughout Western Europe, if we basically saddled Europe with all the debts from the war and didn't allow them to regrow their own industries, there probably would have been a lot of political instability. So it was really important to make sure we fundamentally got back to balance, and that the United States, which at the time had a major surplus, that there was more balance established. What changed was when the United States came off of the gold standard in 1971, and currency tracked very closely with the trade in goods and services up until that point. After 1971, there was very few controls put on exchanges of assets or currency flows, and that allowed financial transactions to grow exponentially higher than transactions in goods and services. And to such an extent, by the year 2000, I think there were 100 times more financial transactions than transactions over goods and services in international markets. And so there's a lot of extra slack in the system, and it looks more practically like foreign countries buying U.S. stocks, buying corporate debt, buying U.S. treasuries and debt, intellectual property, real estate, yes. Things that Americans conceive of as the ticket to financial security in the long run, right? What goes into mortgages and equities that fund retirement, that fund people's savings. More and more of that is starting to flow overseas.
So how can we make it flow back?
Yeah, so that's what the tariff regime is attempting to do. So, on a practical basis, right? What's important to understand is that the U.S. economy really operates still on classic free market capitalist principles, right? We as much as we like to complain about regulation and market intervention by the government, compared to a lot of other nations, we're pretty light touch, at least on the production side, right? We do spend a lot on welfare and entitlement programs, and we fuel a lot with consumption on the government side. Other countries do the opposite, and China in particular spends a lot of government revenue and a lot of policy capital on fueling production. And what that ends up doing is it makes their goods subsidized and essentially cheaper than goods in the U.S. market. And so what they end up doing is earning a lot of the income that would otherwise be going to American producers and American workers who are competing with China. Mm-hmm. And that allows China to save more because it's outcompeting us, it's making more income. And so it creates this imbalance, and in order to counteract those non-market policies, we have to start putting up higher barriers to trade to protect competition and to make sure our own industries aren't eroded by the policy choices, frankly, of foreign governments. And that's really the trade-off. You can say, the U.S. government needs to continue to take its hands off of the market, but what that ends up doing is it defaults to the economic policies of foreign countries instead. And unfortunately, that's something that's a political economic question that was very evident to the founders. The first bill ever passed by Congress was Tariff Act. The War of 1812 with Britain was made very clear to everybody how important having a strong manufacturing base would be to the future of U.S. security. And unfortunately, I think because of the high position we were in after World War II, we sort of rested on our laurels a bit, and we sort of coasted. And it made a lot of sense to pursue the policies we did at the time. There was certainly a lot of interest in opening up export markets for U.S. producers, so there was benefit to American producers. But at a certain point, we passed that point of balance, and we're at a point where we need to readjust. Not because we want to stop all trade flows or prevent imports or to favor industries to such an extent where they're not forced to compete and innovate with good foreign competitors, right? We're still holding fast to the benefits of market competition, but there has to be recognition that there is this fundamental imbalance in the system right now, and it has a lot of consequences for average Americans, workers, and producers, and national security as well.
Well, thank you very much. That's a great place to end.
Thanks for listening to Tocqueville Talks. This episode was produced by Audrey Enghauser. Lucy Southwell provided administrative support. The theme music is called The Girl I Left Behind Me, a popular folk song in early 19th century America, here performed by Jacob Taylor Armading. To learn more about our lecture series and events, our Tocqueville and Beaumont Fellows programs for undergraduates, and to listen to episodes, watch event recordings, or support our work, search on Google for the Tocqueville Center at Furman University. If you enjoyed the episode, please like, subscribe, comment, and share Tocqueville Talks on all your favorite listening services. And visit our YouTube channel for full recordings of past events and episodes. Until next time, goodbye.